welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. The night had always been my sanctuary, a time for quiet walks beneath the glow of streetlights, the hum of distant cars, and the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the wind. It was peaceful, just me and the city. But tonight was different. I had just received another emergency alert. It buzzed in my pocket, the harsh, artificial sound breaking the stillness of the night. I pulled out my phone, half expecting another test or some random warning that would amount to nothing more than a glitch in the system. But the message that greeted me on the screen was simple, and that made it worse. Leave the streets. Do not go outside after dark. The streets are not safe. This is not a drill. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed down the empty sidewalk. Another false alarm. Another test, no doubt, just like the ones we'd been getting over the last few weeks. A mistake, a malfunction. There had been too many alerts lately, all warning us about the same vague threats. Stay indoors. Do not open your door. Do not trust strangers. I didn't know who was behind it, but it was starting to get old. I didn't have the time or the energy for this kind of nonsense. Shoving the phone back in my pocket, I continued walking, trying to ignore the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, this time was different. I brushed it off. The streets were empty, almost too empty for a Saturday night. Usually, the sidewalks were crowded with people coming home from bars or heading to late-night food trucks. But tonight, there was only the faint echo of my footsteps, the rustling of the trees in the breeze, and the occasional distant siren wailing off in the distance. The city always felt alive, even at night. But tonight there was something off. As I walked past the usual strip of bars and convenience stores, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A shadow darted behind a streetlight, vanishing too quickly for me to make out any details. I stopped for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what it was, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Couldn't help it. Something about the quiet felt wrong. I glanced up and down the street, but the shadows stayed still, the silence stretching out even longer. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Still, my pace quickened, and my phone buzzed again in my pocket, the vibration sending a jolt through my body. I pulled it out, expecting another ridiculous notification. This time, the alert read, "You are being watched. Do not leave the street. Seek shelter immediately." I frowned, the words gnawing at the back of my mind. Was this some kind of sick joke? Who would send these messages? It didn't make any sense. But despite my disbelief, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as though the shadows themselves were watching, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I told myself to ignore it, but the nagging fear wouldn't let go. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and continued walking. A few blocks later, I turned a corner and came face to face with something that made my blood run cold. A group of people was standing near a street lamp, but they weren't moving, just standing there frozen in place. I couldn't make out their faces. They were too far away, but their stillness, their unnatural stillness, made me stop dead in my tracks. I hesitated, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were they waiting for something? Or were they waiting for someone? The streetlights above them flickered as if they were struggling to stay on, casting strange shadows across the pavement. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but the moment I did, they all turned toward me. No, not just turned. It was like their heads snapped in my direction, their eyes locking onto me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I stumbled back, my breath shallow, my chest tight with sudden panic. What the hell was happening? Why were they staring at me like that? I turned around and started walking quickly, my heart thumping in my ears. I had to get away from them. Whatever was going on, it wasn't right. The streets didn't feel safe anymore. As I hurried down the sidewalk, I glanced over my shoulder. The group was still there. They hadn't moved, just standing still in the same place, eyes locked on me. It was like they weren't even real people. More like statues, like they were waiting for something to happen. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly dropped it in the panic. This time, the message was different. They are closer than you think. The streets are not safe. Get inside. Now, I could feel it then, the oppressive weight in the air, like something was creeping closer. I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My mind raced. What was going on? Who was behind these alerts? Why were people acting so strange? I had to get out of there. But as I turned the next corner, I saw more figures standing in the street, blocking my path. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding, eyes scanning the scene. They weren't moving, not at all, just standing there in the middle of the road, blocking any chance of escape. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to run. I glanced down at my phone again. This is not a drill. Do not leave the street. I swallowed hard. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. The streets had become a maze. The once familiar paths had turned foreign, as though I was walking through a ghost version of my own city. Each corner I turned, the scene seemed to shift just enough to unsettle me, like the city itself was alive and trying to keep me in check. I kept my pace steady, trying not to glance over my shoulder, but my mind kept replaying the faces, those lifeless, frozen stares from the group near the street lamp. Couldn't shake it. The message on my phone, "Get inside, now," kept echoing in my mind as I walked, the steady thrum of my heart keeping time with my steps. There was no rational explanation for the group I'd seen, nor for the sudden coldness that had gripped the air. But I didn't have time to dwell on it. My instincts were telling me to keep moving to get to safety. But as I walked further into the city, I began to notice something even more unsettling. There were no sounds, no chatter from distant neighbors, no clatter of cars rushing by, no muffled music from the nearby bars. Just silence. The only noise was the faint rhythm of my own footsteps, and they began to feel like a drumbeat in my chest, as if the silence was pushing against me. I took a deep breath and tried to focus. I was close to home. I just had to make it a few more blocks. But as I passed a corner shop, a flicker of movement in the window caught my eye. I stopped, staring into the glass, trying to make out what it was. It wasn't a reflection. Something was moving just beyond the counter inside. I pushed the door open slowly, the bell above it ringing sharply in the quiet. I half expected the shopkeeper to appear, or at least some other person, but the store was empty. No customers, no workers, just rows of shelves, a few random items, and an eerie stillness hanging in the air. My gaze fell on the television in the corner. The screen was flickering, showing the familiar local news channel, but something was wrong with the broadcast. The image was grainy, the anchor's face distorted in unnatural ways, her features warping with each passing second. She was talking about the recent disappearances. Her voice was shaky, almost too slow, as if someone was trying to control the words she was speaking. Authorities are still unable to explain the rash of disappearances that have plagued the city over the past few weeks. With reports coming in daily, the police have issued warnings urging citizens to stay indoors after dark. There is no clear connection between the victims, and authorities are. The screen flickered again, cutting her off. The image was static for a moment, and then the face of the news anchor returned, but it wasn't her anymore. This time it was just eyes, empty, hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. No mouth, no features, just eyes too wide, too vacant. I stumbled back from the screen, my heart hammering. That wasn't right. It wasn't just a malfunction. Something was wrong with the broadcast, with the message itself. I needed to get out of here. The The street outside suddenly felt like a prison. I turned to leave the shop, but my phone buzzed again. A message appeared on the screen, the words flashing in urgent red letters. "It's already happening." My hand shook as I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my mind racing. The world outside was too quiet, too still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I forced myself to keep walking, each step taking me farther from the shop and toward my apartment. As I neared a familiar intersection, I noticed the first signs that something was truly wrong. The police cars that had been parked along the road were gone, replaced by empty spaces. But it wasn't just the vehicles. There were no officers, no crowds, no activity. The entire block had been wiped clean, like a photograph where the details had been erased. I took a left, heading deeper into the residential area, hoping for some normalcy, but it wasn't there. The houses on either side of the street were still, the windows dark and lifeless. A deep knot formed in my stomach, and I quickened my pace. When I turned another corner, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a missing persons flyer, one of those old-school paper ones, tacked up on a telephone pole. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then I saw the name. It was someone I knew, a woman from the neighborhood, someone I had seen walking her dog just a week ago. She had vanished without a trace, and there was nothing but a grainy image of her face printed in black and white, the edges torn and wrinkled. The note under her picture read, "Missing. Last seen near the corner of 5th and Main. If you have any information, contact the authorities immediately." I stood there, staring at the flyer, unable to tear my eyes away. It was just one flyer, but it felt like 1,000 others had been plastered across every street, every alley. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. People were disappearing, people I knew, people who had once walked these streets just like me. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure that leaving the street was a bad idea. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, distant but unmistakable. I froze. It was soft, barely audible, like someone trying to be quiet, but the pattern was wrong. Too steady, too deliberate. My breath hitched, and I whipped around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was no one in sight. The street was empty, as it had been for the past half hour, yet the feeling remained, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept walking, my steps now faster, but the footsteps behind me kept pace, just out of reach. I dared a glance over my shoulder again, and this time I saw it. Someone standing just at the edge of the streetlight's glow. The figure was obscured, their face shadowed, but I could see the outline of a tall body and the hint of movement. A sense of dread twisted in my gut. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Whoever or whatever that figure was, they weren't alone. The buzzing of my phone again. Another alert, and this one made my stomach drop. This is not a drill. The streets are not safe. There is something out there. I tried to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to get home. I had to get somewhere safe, but the city had changed. And it wasn't just the empty streets. It was the people. They were gone. And whatever was out there, whatever was hunting them, was hunting me now too. I couldn't keep my thoughts straight. The streets, the people, the empty silence. It was all becoming a blur, a nightmare that seemed to stretch on forever. My mind kept racing in circles, trying to make sense of everything. But each answer led to another question, and each step I took felt like it brought me closer to some inevitable, terrifying conclusion. The figure I had seen standing in the shadows, the one I'd tried to dismiss, was still there, not in plain sight, but lurking just out of my peripheral vision, hidden behind the flickering streetlights, waiting for me to let my guard down. I could feel its presence like an itch under my skin, a constant pressure pressing down on my chest. I turned another corner, hoping to find some refuge, but the street ahead of me was just as empty as the others. The sound of my own footsteps was deafening in the silence, and with every step, I felt like I was sinking deeper into the city's cold, dark heart. My phone buzzed again, but this time I didn't check it. I couldn't afford to get distracted. Whatever was happening, whatever was out there, it was getting closer. My breath quickened, and I broke into a half jog, the rhythm of my movements matching the frantic pace of my thoughts. The air was thick with unease, as if the world itself had stopped breathing, holding its collective breath as something terrible approached. I passed a row of houses, their windows dark and lifeless, and that's when I saw them. More figures standing at the edges of the street, just like the ones I had seen earlier. This time, they weren't in a group, but scattered, positioned at various points along the road. They were motionless, their heads turned slightly, but always facing me, as if they had been waiting for my arrival. I froze. The distance between us was far enough that I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I could feel their eyes on me, boring into me like invisible needles. I forced myself to keep walking, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, as if the very act of moving required every ounce of energy I had left. The streetlights above me flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced and shifted, creating a disorienting effect. The light around me was unstable, like the world itself was malfunctioning. I turned the corner again, trying to break free from the growing sense of dread, but the figures followed. Always just out of reach, always just beyond the light. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My phone buzzed again, the sound like a hammer in the quiet night, and this time I couldn't ignore it. I pulled it out of my pocket, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. The message that appeared sent a fresh wave of panic through me. "They're closer than you think. Don't look back." Couldn't help it. My head jerked around, my eyes scanning the shadows, looking for movement. The figures were still there, but now they weren't just standing. They were shifting, moving ever so slightly, as if testing the limits of the darkness. And I could see it, the outline of one of them, the faintest glimpse of something unnatural in the darkness. A figure too tall, too thin, its limbs stretching at unnatural angles. A shadow, a distortion in the night. It wasn't human. I didn't need to see more. I had seen enough. My heart pounded in my chest, and the air around me seemed to thicken, pushing me down. Couldn't breathe. The world was suffocating me, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone, frozen to the ground. It was getting harder to think, to make sense of anything. I could feel my sanity slipping away, piece by piece, as the shadows closed in. I looked down at my phone again, half hoping the next message would make things clearer. But when I saw the screen, I felt a jolt of terror. The message wasn't a warning. It wasn't even a sentence. It was a single word: run. I didn't hesitate. I didn't need to think. I spun around and bolted down the street, ignoring the cramp that shot through my side, ignoring the panic that threatened to take over. I had no plan, no destination, only the overwhelming need to escape. My footsteps echoed in the stillness, and the world seemed to close in on me with every step I took. The figures, the shadows, were still there, following me, just out of sight but always present. They moved in a way that defied logic, like they were part of the darkness itself. There was no clear shape, no definition, just the feeling that they were there, always there, closing in. I turned another corner, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. My phone buzzed once more, but this time I didn't even look. I couldn't stop running. I had to get away from them. I had to, but the more I ran, the further I seemed to get from safety. It felt like I was running in circles, trapped in a loop, the same stretch of road repeating itself over and over, like I was stuck in a nightmare that wouldn't end. The city had become a labyrinth, and the walls were closing in. Then I saw it. A building ahead, a familiar storefront. My apartment was just beyond it, only a few blocks away. I knew I could make it, but as I approached, something stopped me cold. A figure stood in front of the door, blocking the way. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally long, bending at the wrong angles, its face a shadow of emptiness. It wasn't one of the figures I had seen before. This one was different. It was real. The darkness had come alive. I could feel it in my bones, the coldness that radiated from it, the heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. I backed away, my pulse racing. I had no idea what it was, what it wanted, or how I was supposed to fight it. But one thing was clear. There was no way forward, no escape. I turned again, but the street behind me was gone. The familiar buildings, the shops, everything was gone. There was nothing but darkness. The figures, no, the shadows were everywhere now, surrounding me. They were closing in, and I knew, deep in my gut, that there was no way out. I was trapped. The darkness swallowed everything. There were no streetlights, no guiding flicker of light to keep me tethered to reality. The air had thickened into something oppressive, like an unseen weight pressing down on me, forcing my chest to tighten with every breath. The silence had become unbearable, like a suffocating fog that crept into my ears, into my thoughts, leaving nothing but the frantic pulse of my heartbeat. I kept moving, my feet moving almost on their own, stumbling over the uneven ground. Yet there was nowhere to go. The world had warped into something unrecognizable, twisted beyond any sense of logic. My apartment building, the place I had thought would offer safety, was a mirage, a lie. The door, the entryway I had seen a second ago, was gone. In its place was an endless stretch of darkness. The concrete of the street faded into the night like it had never existed. I stood frozen, my breath shallow, hands trembling at my sides. The shadows had closed in, surrounding me from all angles, but still, I couldn't bring myself to move. I didn't know where to go, what to do. The last time I had looked, the door had been there. The building had been there. But now it was as if the entire street had dissolved, leaving nothing but the oppressive void of nothingness. I turned slowly, half expecting to see the figures again, those tall, unnaturally long shapes lurking just out of my sight. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the unbearable silence. I wanted to scream, to shout, but I couldn't bring myself to make a sound. What if they heard me? What if the darkness itself was listening? I took a hesitant step forward, my foot crunching against the unseen ground beneath me, but my mind was spinning. This didn't make sense. How could it not make sense? There was no way I was imagining it. I had seen the building. I had seen the door, the familiar building with the chipped paint, the one I had walked past every day for years. Yet now it was as if the whole thing had never existed, as if it had been erased from the world entirely. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. It's just a trick of the mind, I told myself. I'm disoriented. I need to get control. But when I opened them again, the world hadn't changed. The shadows were closer now, almost too close to see. They pressed against my vision like they were creeping up from the corners of my mind. The air felt alive. It was heavy, thick with the scent of something wrong, something decayed. I took another step, more cautiously this time. The pavement beneath my feet was solid, yet the world felt like it was crumbling around me. I reached out for the air, half expecting to feel something solid. Maybe the metal of a railing or the cool stone of a brick wall. But there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of dark, empty space. Felt like a dream, but it was too real. It has to be real. I gripped the sides of my head, willing myself to snap out of it. But the more I focused, the more everything seemed to dissolve. My thoughts were sliding away, slipping like sand through my fingers. I couldn't focus on any one thing for too long before it dissolved, becoming just another fragment of my crumbling sanity. I turned in a circle, eyes darting, scanning the black void around me. But all I saw were the same figures standing still, their silhouettes stretched and writhing in the darkness. They weren't moving, not yet, but I knew they were watching me. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their faces. I shook my head again, trying to clear the fog that had settled into my thoughts. Focus, I thought. Just focus on the next step. Don't panic. I had to keep moving. I had to get out of this place, whatever it was. And then it happened. A door appeared. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light. Just a sliver, a tiny crack in the nothingness. But as I drew closer, The door became clearer, the outline sharper. It looked like an old wooden door, the kind you would find in an old house, with peeling paint and faded brass handles. But there was something wrong with it. Something off. I reached out tentatively, my fingers brushing the cool wood, feeling the texture beneath my fingertips. Felt like a door, solid and real. But then I noticed something strange. The handle didn't turn. It was stuck, frozen in place as if the door was locked, but locked by something more than just a bolt. I tried again, harder this time, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic began to claw at the edges of my mind, but I forced myself to remain calm. There was no way I was going to let this door trap me. No way. I pulled again, more desperately now, throwing my shoulder against it, but it was useless. It was like the door didn't exist, like the whole thing was an illusion, a trick to keep me in place. I slammed my fist against the wood, my breath coming in ragged bursts, and that's when I heard it. A faint creak, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, came from behind me, a soft rustling sound, like fabric moving, like something in the darkness was stirring. I turned quickly, heart hammering, my pulse thrumming in my ears, and then I saw it. The figure was standing right behind me, only inches away. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a blur of dark shapes, like ink bleeding into water. Its body was unnaturally tall, its limbs stretching and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. But what was most disturbing was the way it moved. It didn't walk, it didn't run, it just shifted, glided. It didn't need to move like a human. It wasn't bound by the same rules of reality. Its presence was suffocating, like the darkness itself was alive and had taken on form. I stepped back, my hand instinctively reaching for the door handle once more, desperate to escape. But as I touched it, something changed. The door warped, twisted and bent, pulling away from the frame. And I saw it, the face. There, behind the door, beyond the warped wood and the illusion of escape, was something far worse. A face, pale and stretched, with eyes that were far too wide, unblinking, staring straight through me. The face wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. The door was an illusion, and I was trapped. I had no choice now. I had no way out. The figure behind me let out a low, guttural noise, a sound that scraped across my skin, making my spine tighten in terror. The darkness was closing in, the shadows had gathered around me, and there was no escaping them. No way out, and just like that, I understood. There was no escape. There was only the darkness, and whatever was coming with it. The air had become heavier, as if the very atmosphere was thickening, turning against me. The shadows moved in time with my heartbeat, pulsing and twisting with every frantic breath I took. The silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums like a vice, had become deafening. I could hear nothing but the rhythmic thudding of my own pulse, growing faster, louder, as the figure behind me loomed closer, its presence suffocating, like the chill of a grave seeping into my bones. I couldn't think. I couldn't focus. My thoughts were spiraling, unraveling like frayed thread, each new thought replaced by panic. I turned back to the door, the warped, distorted thing that had become my only hope of escape. I yanked at the handle again, but it was no use. It was a trick. The door wasn't real. The escape I had been desperate to find was an illusion, and now I was trapped. The figure in the shadows didn't move. It didn't have to. It simply stood there, its eyes, those eyes, locked onto me, unblinking, as though they were seeing deep into the very core of my soul. Every instinct told me to run, to scream, but I knew it wouldn't help. There was nowhere to run to, and screaming would only make things worse. I slammed my fist against the door, rage and terror flooding my chest. Why? Why was this happening? What was this place? What were these things? There was no answer. Not from the door, not from the shadows, not from the figure. Only the oppressive silence, suffocating and absolute. The air felt electric, charged with an energy I couldn't comprehend. A raw, chaotic force that had no respect for the laws of the world I once knew. And then, faintly, so faintly it was barely a whisper, I heard it. A sound, distant but unmistakable. An echo. It was like a voice, but not a voice in the traditional sense. It was an echo, a reverberation of something old, something primal, that filled the space around me, resonating deep within my chest. The sound was indecipherable, like a language lost to time, filled with tones that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just sound. It was a vibration, a force that seemed to ripple through the air, through the very ground beneath me. I froze. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence intensify. The shadows around me seemed to grow, stretching and creeping toward the door I had been trying to escape through, wrapping around it like cold, writhing fingers. The echo came again, louder this time, but still distant, as though it were coming from somewhere beyond the fabric of reality itself. It was almost as if the echo had a life of its own, like it was being dragged through the vast, empty spaces of the void. I didn't know what it meant or who it belonged to, but I could feel it digging into my mind, scratching at the edges of my sanity. I backed away from the door, my legs shaking as though they had turned to jelly. Every part of me screamed to run, but I couldn't move, not while the echo lingered, tugging at the strings of my consciousness, forcing me to listen, to understand something I couldn't grasp. And then, through the hum of the echo, I heard another sound. This one was closer, sharper, like a gasp, a breath, not my own. I turned my head, my eyes searching frantically through the darkness, but I couldn't see it at first. The shadows had swallowed everything, had stretched and twisted to the point that I couldn't make out any details. But I knew it was there. I could feel it. Its presence was undeniable. The darkness was moving, shifting, and then I saw them. Eyes, dozens of eyes, all blinking in unison, glowing faintly in the dark. They were scattered throughout the blackness, some higher than others, some lower, but all of them focused on me, tracking my every movement. I could barely breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a warning. What are they? The figure, the one I had seen earlier, the one that had stayed in place, wasn't just standing anymore. It was growing, not in size, but in presence. It wasn't human, couldn't be. Its form had begun to shift, to stretch and distort, becoming something far more monstrous, far more alien. Its limbs were no longer recognizable, no longer bound by human proportions. They twisted and curved, growing longer, thinner, as though they were reaching out for something, for me. The air was thick with that same unearthly tension, and I could feel the pressure building, pressing in on me from all sides, as though the very fabric of the world was being stretched and pulled, like a thread about to snap. The echoes in my mind grew louder, closer, reverberating in my skull, and I couldn't escape them. They were pulling me in, dragging me towards something I didn't understand. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but the shadows were closing in, wrapping themselves around me, blocking my way, cutting off every escape route. It felt like the very streets themselves were alive, twisting and bending, trapping me in a maze of darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was caught in my throat, swallowed by the silence that surrounded me. The eyes in the shadows blinked again, all at once. I could see them clearly now, each one gleaming like polished glass, their pupils reflecting the empty void around me. They were watching, waiting. They knew I couldn't escape. I turned back to the door, the one that wasn't real, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something. A flicker of light, a shift in the darkness behind it. It was so fast I could barely catch it, but it was there, a figure, a shape, something human maybe, but distorted. And then it was gone. I slammed my hand against the door, desperation flooding through me, but it didn't respond. It was still warped, still solid. The door was nothing but a lie, a cruel trick, and yet I couldn't look away from it. It had to be real. There had to be something behind it, but the more I stared, the more I felt the eyes behind me, pressing into my back. The shadows were so close now. I could feel their cold breath on my skin. And then, as if the air itself had broken, I heard it. The scream. It wasn't my own. The figure behind me made no sound. But in the silence, that scream rang through my ears like a breaking glass, splintering everything around me. Everything I thought I understood. And I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel my pulse in my throat, pounding harder than it had ever been before. The scream still lingered in the air, echoing like a faint whisper, its source impossible to pinpoint. It was as if the world around me had fractured, splitting into pieces, and the echoes of those pieces were now pressing in on me from every direction. The walls of reality seemed to be collapsing, closing in tighter, suffocating the little space I had left to breathe. The shadows had become something alive, something sentient, like they were listening to my every thought, waiting for me to make my next move. And no matter how much I tried to stay still, to remain silent, I couldn't escape their gaze. It felt like they were everywhere, those eyes, watching, waiting. They were not just in the shadows anymore. They were in my mind, slipping past my defenses, curling their way into the recesses of my thoughts. It was as though they had always been there, lurking beneath the surface of everything, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. I turned, slowly, trying to keep my back to the wall, but the darkness seemed to stretch in all directions, blurring the edges of the world. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. Was I still on the street? Was I even in the same reality? The streetlights, the ones that should have been casting pools of light onto the ground, were nothing but faint memories. No glow, no warmth, just emptiness. And then, from the depths of the void, came the softest sound. A whisper, a name. It was my name. I froze. The whisper echoed, faint but clear, as if it were being spoken right behind me, even though I couldn't hear anyone's footsteps. No breathing, no sign of life at all, except the thing that had been following me, growing nearer with every passing second. It wasn't just a voice. It was something else, something more primal, more guttural. It felt like it had been carved from the deepest, darkest parts of the earth, and now it was clinging to me, pressing into my mind, rattling against the cages of my sanity. The figure, still watching, had not moved, but I could feel it. The tension was palpable, the air around it vibrating with an invisible energy, a hum that was almost too quiet to hear. Every instinct told me to flee, to run far, far away from the malevolent presence I knew was closing in. But I couldn't run. My legs felt like stone. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the unseen force pressing down on me. The echo of my name persisted, pulling me, dragging me deeper into the darkness, deeper into the place where reason no longer existed. The eyes, there were more of them now. I turned slowly, and the shadows shifted with me, their movements fluid, almost graceful. The eyes blinked in unison, and I could hear the faint sound of their gaze following my every movement, tracking me with unsettling precision. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the suffocating weight of their stare. I wanted to scream again, but my throat was dry, my mouth dry as if I had not spoken in years. I had no voice anymore. I was a hollow thing, a shell. The darkness had stripped everything away, leaving only fear in its wake. And then, just as I was about to collapse into the abyss of my own mind, I saw it, the door. But this time it wasn't warped. It wasn't distorted. The surface of it was smooth, familiar. An old wooden door, the kind you'd expect to find in some forgotten house, abandoned and lost to time. The brass handle gleamed, catching the faintest sliver of light that was still clinging to the edges of the night. It wasn't real, though. Not in the way I wanted it to be. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding harder now, my hands shaking as they reached for the door's handle. The pull of it was almost magnetic, like it was calling to me, drawing me closer despite the fear that had lodged itself in my chest. Every part of me screamed to stay away, to not touch it, to turn and run as fast as I could. But I couldn't. With a trembling hand, I gripped the handle and turned. It didn't open. The door was locked. But the lock wasn't just physical. It was something more, something beyond simple metal and wood. It was as if the door had been sealed, not by human hands, but by something far older, far more ancient. The very energy surrounding it felt wrong, alien. The feeling in my gut told me this wasn't just a door. It was a gateway, a trap. I yanked harder, desperation flooding my system. But the door refused to budge. The eyes behind me blinked again, and the whisper came once more. My name, followed by something else. A warning. I couldn't quite make out the words, but I felt them. I felt them in my bones, in my blood. Don't open it, the echo seemed to say. But why? What was on the other side of the door? Was it a way out? Or was it something worse? I slammed my fist against the door in frustration. The sound reverberated around me, shattering the silence that had held me captive for so long. The reverberation didn't stop. It didn't just die away. It lingered, stretched, becoming a low hum that filled the air, vibrating in my very core. The hum twisted into a low growl, like something hungry, something ancient, waking up. The shadows shifted. The eyes moved. They were closer now. I could feel them, surrounding me, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me. It was as if the walls were closing in, as if I were trapped in a room, and all I had was the door, this cursed, sealed door and the watching eyes. I tried again, turning the handle once more. This time it gave, just a little, just enough to let me know that there was something on the other side. Something waiting. The sound of the door creaking open was deafening in the silence, a noise that sliced through the tension like a blade through fabric. I stepped back, unsure if I should push it open any further. Behind the door was nothing. No light, no sound, just an endless black void. I hesitated, my mind racing, and then the growl came again, louder this time. A low rumble that shook the air, filled my ears, and rattled my teeth. The darkness beyond the door stirred, as if something was coming through, something that should never have been allowed to escape. And I realized, too late, that the door wasn't a way out. It was a way in. The growl grew louder, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the air. It wasn't just a noise anymore, it was a presence, a force that I could feel in my very chest, vibrating with a terrifying power that threatened to collapse everything around me. My body was frozen, caught between the allure of the door and the crushing weight of the darkness closing in. It was a choice, or perhaps an illusion of a choice. Step into the unknown and risk whatever horrors lay beyond, or turn around, face the eyes, and pray they wouldn't catch me. The door was slightly ajar now, its old hinges creaking, groaning under the strain of something else. Something that wasn't supposed to be in this world. I could feel the pull, an invisible tug at my very core, as if the darkness beyond the threshold were calling to me. Promised answers, but I knew deep down that those answers would come at a price. There was no way out of this. There never had been. This was no longer a matter of escape. It was about survival, and yet I couldn't look away from the door. It beckoned me with an almost hypnotic power, like an open wound, raw and vulnerable. I could feel the edge of my sanity fraying, like the very fabric of my mind was being shredded by the tension in the air. It was as if something was going to reach through that door, something that had been waiting, watching me for far too long. I glanced behind me, my pulse rising again as the eyes seemed to multiply. They were everywhere, flickering in the darkness like stars in a void. I couldn't count them, couldn't place them, they just were. But I could feel them, their weight pressing down on me, suffocating me, slowly crushing the last vestiges of my will to fight. And then, there it was again, the whisper. My name, clearer this time, more insistent. It seemed to come from the depths of the darkness beyond the door. A voice I couldn't understand but felt in every inch of my body. The sound wasn't just a whisper. It was a vibration that resonated with something ancient and deep, like a call from the void itself. Something was waiting. Something wanted me. I staggered backward, shaking my head, willing myself not to listen, to resist. But the darkness had already seeped into my mind, its tendrils curling around my thoughts, weaving through the very fabric of my consciousness. The growl grew deeper, more guttural, and I realized too late that the sound wasn't a threat. It was a warning from the thing that had been following me all along, the thing I had been running from. The shadows closed in around me, their oppressive weight pressing down on me like the air in a vacuum, suffocating and inescapable. I could feel my heart racing, beating so loudly in my chest that it drowned out everything else. But I couldn't escape. There was no escaping the eyes, no escaping the shadows. They were part of me now, part of the nightmare that had become my reality. I turned back to the door, desperate, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I didn't question. I yanked the door open, forcing it to reveal what lay beyond. The void beyond the door wasn't empty. It wasn't dark either, not in the way I expected. It was something else. It was a presence, a feeling that sent a chill down my spine, a coldness that I could feel deep in my bones. The air beyond the threshold felt wrong, unnatural, like the space itself was contaminated, polluted by something other. And there, standing at the edge of the darkness, was something that hadn't been there before. It wasn't human. It wasn't even alive in the way I understood life. It was a mass of swirling shadows, twisted and shifting, but at the center of it, there were eyes. Hundreds of eyes, all staring, all watching. Some were wide and unblinking, others narrowed with a sick, predatory gleam. They saw me, they knew me, and they were waiting. I felt a wave of nausea roll through me, the air in my lungs turning to ice as the presence stepped forward, moving out of the darkness with a fluidity that was unnatural, inhuman. It was like a shape made from smoke and nightmares, its form shifting with every step, constantly changing, never staying the same. There was something about it that was wrong, something deeply wrong. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to dissolve and reform in my vision, like it wasn't even a thing, just a manifestation of pure wrongness. I wanted to close the door, to slam it shut and run, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't escape the pull of its gaze. It was hypnotic, like the very act of seeing it was enough to erase my will, to draw me deeper into its presence. The growl returned, louder this time, so loud it seemed to reverberate in my skull. I could feel it pounding against my mind, shaking me to the core. The eyes, they were all around me. They were in my mind now, crawling through my thoughts, turning them into something else. Something dark. I backed away slowly, my chest tight, my legs barely holding me up. I was choking, suffocating under the weight of its presence. But I couldn't stop, couldn't run. I couldn't escape. The door was no longer a way out. It was a gateway, a trap that had already been sprung, a snare that had already closed around me. And then I saw it. At the center of the shadowy mass, the eyes finally stopped moving. They focused on me, all of them simultaneously, locking me in their gaze. There was a pulse, a beat, a rhythm to it, like a drum echoing in the deep recesses of my mind. And then came the speak, the thing that had been calling me, the thing I had been avoiding. Its voice, if you could call it that, was a distortion. A voice that didn't come from a mouth, but from the very space around me. Said one thing: "You should not have come." I froze. It wasn't just a statement. It was a judgment. I had crossed a threshold I should never have touched. I had opened the door, and now there was no going back. Whatever it was coming for me. It was no longer a question of if it would attack. It was a matter of when. The air was still, thick with the promise of something terrible, something inevitable. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I could only watch as the darkness, the eyes, the thing that haunted this place, began to take its first steps toward me. And I knew there was no escape. The air grew thick, choking in its weight. I could feel it pressing against my skin, clinging to every breath I drew, every heartbeat that pulsed erratically in my chest. The shadows closed in tighter around me, the eyes never leaving my own, their cold, unblinking gaze boring into my soul. I could hear them, feel them, every inch of my body responding to their presence. Their unspoken will wrapping around me like an iron chain. "You should not have come," the voice echoed again. This time, it wasn't just a sentence. It was a command, a forceful statement of truth, like an inevitable verdict passed down from something ancient and unfathomable. The darkness shifted, swirling, and I could sense something moving within it. Something that wasn't just part of the shadow, but something that controlled it. I wanted to move. I wanted to run. My body screamed at me to get out, to find the nearest exit, to break free from the suffocating grip of the eyes and the shadows. But I couldn't. My legs wouldn't obey. My arms were locked at my sides, my hands frozen in place, as if some unseen force was holding me in place. I had stepped into something bigger than me, something that existed outside of the boundaries of the world I knew. This wasn't a normal fear. This was a primal terror that dug into your very soul, a terror that didn't just come from the unknown. It came from the knowledge that you shouldn't know what was coming. The eyes blinked, and in that blink, something changed. The presence shifted, drawing closer, becoming more solid. I could feel its movement, as though the very space around me was bending and warping, folding inward toward the source of the shadow. The creature was no longer just a part of the darkness. It was emerging from it. I could hear the scrape of something dragging across the floor, a noise that sounded too much like claws against stone. The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, the air vibrating with the force of its movements. I fought it. I tried to fight the paralysis that gripped me, but the harder I fought, the stronger it became. My breath came in shallow gasps, every inch of me trembling under the pressure. There was nothing left in me but fear, raw, unfiltered fear. And then the first step came. I could feel it more than hear it, an oppressive force crashing down upon me. The creature's footfall was like the world itself shaking. I was a helpless witness, powerless against what was happening, unable to tear my eyes away as the thing moved closer. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake by opening that door. I had unleashed something that should have stayed sealed. And now there was no turning back. The shadows bent and twisted, expanding, their form shifting like liquid, stretching toward me in a way that shouldn't have been possible. The eyes flickered, moving, revolving within the dark mass like trapped souls, like the remnants of something long forgotten and best left undisturbed. There was a sickening feeling in my gut, a deep, unsettling sensation that I was being observed, not just by the eyes themselves, but by whatever dark intelligence controlled them. "You should not have come." The voice wasn't just in my head now. It was all around me, vibrating through the walls, seeping into the ground beneath my feet. It was in the air I breathed, in the soundless whispers that followed my every move. It was a presence I could no longer escape. I could feel it, crawling up my spine, twisting around my neck, tightening with every passing moment. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, the creature was standing right in front of me. Its form was a nightmare, a grotesque mass of shifting shadows and writhing limbs. I could barely make sense of it. Each part of it seemed to defy logic, as if it were an impossible fusion of nightmares and forgotten horrors. Its body was elongated, twisting, impossibly long, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways no human body ever could. The eyes, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, they were everywhere. The creature's skin, if you could even call it skin, was a blend of darkness and something else, something that was almost translucent, like it was made of shadows that had been given form. The eyes were its face, its expression, and those eyes, God, those eyes, stared at me with a hunger I could feel in my bones. I tried to scream. I tried to move, but nothing came out. My mouth was dry, my voice stolen. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very act of breathing was an offense. Every instinct in me told me to run, to escape, to do whatever it took to get away from this creature. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to fight. The thing lowered its head, the eyes narrowing as it leaned closer, studying me like an insect under a magnifying glass. I could feel its breath, if it even had breath, on my face, a cold, suffocating wind that tasted of decay and death. "You are not what I expected," it hissed, its voice a twisted, guttural rasp that sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. The words didn't make sense, but I could feel them, as if the sound was coming from deep within my mind rather than from its mouth. The thing wasn't speaking in a conventional sense. It was transmitting its words, its thoughts, directly into my consciousness. "I thought you would run. Most do. But you stayed." The thing's voice coiled around the words, each one dripping with venom. The eyes blinked again, but this time, the blink felt deliberate, as though the creature was taking a moment to decide what to do next. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't just a victim. I wasn't just a hapless soul caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was a choice, an offering, a test. The creature's long, clawed fingers reached toward me, slow, deliberate, like a predator savoring its prey. I could feel the air crackle with electricity as its hand hovered near my face. The shadows seemed to come alive, curling around its limbs, following its movements like obedient servants. Then, with a speed that defied logic, the creature's fingers shot forward, gripping my face. The pain was instantaneous, white-hot, as if every nerve in my body was being set aflame. Couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. I was paralyzed, unable to move, locked in place by its grip. Its touch felt like nothing solid, nothing real. Just the unbearable pressure of something wrong pressing down on me. I felt my skin crawl, my muscles seize, as if the very touch of it was trying to erase me. "You should not have come," the voice whispered again. And this time I believed it. The pain was all-consuming. It felt like my body was being ripped apart from the inside, every nerve screaming in agony as the creature's grip tightened around my face. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words wouldn't form. The strength wouldn't come. My body was numb, paralyzed by the sheer force of its presence. Its fingers were like shadows themselves, solid yet insubstantial, wrapping around my skull with an unnatural grip that made me feel like I was being crushed from the inside out. I could hear the creature's voice again, low and distorted, its words dripping like poison into my mind. "You thought you could escape." The voice wasn't a voice at all. It was a thought, an intrusion into my mind that I couldn't block, couldn't push away. It was everywhere, inside my head, in my chest, in the very air around me. "You thought you could outrun this." I tried to think, to find a way out, but it was as if my mind had been invaded, my thoughts tangled and distorted by its power. I was trapped, caught in a net of darkness, woven with the threads of terror and hopelessness. My world had become small, suffocating, a claustrophobic prison with no escape. Every inch of me was burning, every fiber of my being felt as though it was being torn apart. But there was no relief, no release. The creature's form loomed above me, its eyes, those countless, endless eyes, staring down at me with an unblinking cold hunger. They saw me, they knew me, and in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just some accident, some random encounter with something I didn't understand. No, this thing had been waiting for me, watching me. It had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. "You are mine now," the creature said, its voice a twisted echo of my own thoughts. Its fingers dug deeper into my skin, and I felt something shift, something break inside of me. My vision blurred, the edges of my mind splintering as if reality itself was dissolving. I could hear the creature's laughter, a low, guttural sound that reverberated in my chest, rattling my bones. But then something changed. The world around me seemed to fracture. The shadows began to distort, bending and warping, as if the very fabric of the place was unraveling. The eyes shifted, their countless pupils twitching, their gaze flickering, as if the creature itself was losing its grip on me. There was a crackling in the air, like the tension of a snapped wire, and I felt a sudden surge of energy, a spark of clarity that cut through the suffocating fog of fear and paralysis. I gasped. The pain, the crushing, burning pain, suddenly stopped. The creature's grip loosened, its fingers still hovering inches from my face, but the pressure was gone. My body trembled as I sucked in a breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in my lungs. I didn't understand what had just happened. I didn't know what had changed, but in that moment, something in me shifted. Something deep inside me snapped back into place. The creature didn't seem to notice, or perhaps it didn't care. It was still staring at me, still grinning with its countless eyes, its expression a grotesque mask of hunger. It leaned closer, its twisted, inhuman face hovering just inches from mine, its breath cold and foul. I could feel its presence all around me, pressing down on me, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of doom. "You cannot fight me," it hissed. "You cannot outrun what is inside of you." But this time I didn't let it in. This time I fought back. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed against its influence, against the crushing weight of its presence. I refused to succumb to it. I wasn't some pawn in its twisted game, some helpless victim trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I was stronger than this. I had to be. I focused on the pain. I focused on the way my body felt, the way it burned, the way every nerve seemed to be screaming at me. I used it. I used that pain as fuel, as a weapon. I let it tear through me, like a fire that burned away the fear, burned away the terror that had clouded my mind. And then I moved. It was instinct. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. It was a reaction, a primal instinct to survive. My hand shot up, slamming into the creature's arm with a force that shocked even me. I didn't know where the strength came from, but I felt it surge through me like an electric current, crackling with raw power. The creature hissed, a sharp, inhuman sound, as its grip faltered. Its fingers recoiled, snapping back like a snake that had been struck. The air around me hummed with the sudden shift, the crackle of energy that surged through the room. For the first time, I felt a sense of control. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't defenseless. The creature stumbled back, its form shifting, warping, but its eyes never left mine. The hunger in them had faded, replaced by something colder, something far more sinister. "You think you can resist me?" it growled, its voice now a low, bone-chilling snarl. "You are mine, whether you accept it or not." But I wasn't listening anymore. I was done listening. With every ounce of strength I had, I pulled away, throwing myself to the side, away from its reach. The creature's shadowy form flickered, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know if there was a way out, but I couldn't stay here, not with it so close, not with the weight of its gaze pressing against me like a vice. I ran, through the darkened room, through the labyrinth of twisting corridors, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. The world seemed to collapse around me, but I pushed forward. I wasn't going to be its prey. I wasn't going to be its victim. I would find a way out even if it killed me. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still with me, following me, stalking me, watching me. And I knew that no matter how fast I ran, no matter how far I went, there was no escaping it. I could feel it now, the creature's presence, like an unshakable weight pressing down on me, even as I ran. My legs burned. My heart pounded against my chest like a war drum. But I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Each step felt like it was tearing me apart from the inside, but I kept pushing forward, faster, harder, as if my life depended on it. And maybe it did. The darkness around me had taken on a life of its own. The shadows were no longer passive, no longer just the absence of light. They were alive, moving, shifting, creeping along the walls like tendrils of some great, ancient creature. I could feel them reaching for me, pulling at my clothes, my skin, but I fought them off, tearing myself free with desperate, ragged breaths. The air itself had changed. It was thick, suffocating, as if the very space around me was warping, bending to the will of whatever force controlled this place. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, too loud, too frantic, echoing in the oppressive silence. My pulse hammered in my ears, and every part of me screamed to stop, to collapse, to give in to the darkness. But I couldn't, not yet. I didn't dare look behind me. Couldn't. I knew what was there. I knew what was following me. Its eyes, its hunger, its twisted, relentless pursuit. The creature was close. I could feel it. I could sense its movements, even without hearing its footsteps. It was closing in, like a predator stalking its prey, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. I reached the door. I didn't even know where I was anymore. All I could see was the exit, the faint light beyond it, the promise of freedom. I shoved my hand against the cold metal of the door, my fingers trembling with exhaustion, but it wouldn't budge. It wouldn't open. I tried again, harder this time, slamming my body into the door with all the strength I had left. The door shuddered but didn't give. The darkness was closing in now, the creature's form shifting in the corner of my vision. Its eyes watching, waiting, savoring every moment of my struggle. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and I could feel my resolve cracking, my hope shattering. But I couldn't give up, couldn't let it win. With a primal scream, I pulled at the door again, desperation flooding every fiber of my being. My fingers slipped, numb from the pain, but I kept pulling. Couldn't stop. There was no other option now. The door had to open, and then finally the latch clicked. The door flew open with a sudden burst of cold air, the light from beyond spilling into the room like a flood. For a moment, I stood there, dazed, my body trembling, my vision swimming with exhaustion. I could feel the pull of the darkness behind me, the weight of the creature's presence still bearing down on me, but I didn't hesitate. I ran through the door, into the blinding light. My feet pounded against the ground, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. The light was my salvation. The light was my escape. But as I ran, I felt the darkness follow. The creature's presence was still there, hanging in the air like a shadow, like a suffocating cloud that wouldn't lift. I could feel its eyes on me, even as I tried to outrun it, even as the light grew brighter and more blinding. I wanted to scream, to shout, but no sound came. The light was too much, too overwhelming, too perfect, and I felt myself beginning to unravel, the world around me starting to warp again. I didn't know where I was anymore. The landscape around me had changed. The streets had become unfamiliar, the buildings strange and distorted. The air was thick with an unnatural fog, and the ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if the world itself was cracking apart. I was no longer sure if I was running towards something or away from it. Every step I took seemed to bring me closer to the edge of some precipice, some unknown place where reality itself would cease to exist. The creature was still with me. I could feel it. The darkness, the shadows, the eyes, they were everywhere. The air was heavy with its presence, and I knew in my bones that it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, waiting for me to slip up. It knew that I was weak, that I was slipping. The exhaustion was taking over, my body was giving out, and I was running on fumes. I could feel the weight of my own panic, the terror crushing me as I tried to keep moving, tried to stay one step ahead of it. But I wasn't fast enough. The ground beneath me gave way. I stumbled, my foot catching on something, and before I could react, I was falling into the darkness. The world tilted around me, spinning, blurring, until there was nothing but the sound of my own breath, ragged and desperate, and the creature's laughter, low, mocking, and too close. The fall seemed endless, and as I tumbled through the dark, I reached out, desperate for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing. Only the weight of the creature's eyes, the suffocating pull of its presence, dragging me down into the abyss. And then I stopped. The world went still. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't sure what I was seeing. The world was dark, but the air was different. The light was gone, the creature was gone, and I was left in a place I didn't recognize, a place that felt wrong, like something had been taken from me. I could feel it in the air, the shift in reality, the break in the fabric of the world. The place felt empty, hollow, like a mirror reflecting something that was never meant to exist. And then I heard the voice again. "You shouldn't have come." The words wrapped around me like chains, cold and suffocating. The truth was clear now, and I understood. I had been a test, a choice, a victim in a game that was far older than I could ever comprehend. The creature was still here, somewhere watching me, waiting for me to accept what I had become. And maybe, just maybe, I was already too late.